They say it's not easy being green, but I beg to differ. Sorry, Kermit. If you couldn't guess, green is actually my favorite color. Enchanting emeralds, vivacious viridians, shimmering chartreuses, I adore them all. So whenever I come across some green fabric, I snatch it up and squirrel it away so I can create some sort of glorious green garment. I also love alliteration, but I haven't figured out how to make a dress out of a literary device. I have two green fabrics in particular that I've been holding on to for quite a while. This lightweight shimmering rayon and a crisp striped cotton, and I think it's about time to turn them into their final form. I decided to start out with the rayon. This was something I got during the Joann's closing sales, may she rest in peace, and I've been planning on turning it into a swishy bias cut dress ever since I got it, but I've held off for all this time because working with bias cut fabric kinda scares me, to be honest. Cutting fabric on the bias means you're going diagonally across the grid formed by weaving the warp and weft threads together. This gives fabric some more stretch, hence why bias tape is so good for binding curves. It can stretch around them. In garments, cutting on the bias can make them drapier and slinkier, but also, from my limited experience, it's a pain in the ass to work with, since the fabric is stretchier and therefore less stable. So before jumping straight into cutting up my no longer available for purchase fabric, I made a mock-up. I went with very angular shapes for the bodice because I knew I wanted to add godets to the skirt, and I wanted to continue that triangular shape throughout the rest of the dress. So, I've got the mock-up for the bodice done. I'm mostly happy with it. There's some more adjustments I need to make. I added some darts to the bust, which definitely helped. This bit is a little too loose and floppy, and I want it to come down a little bit further, more to like the hip, so I need to redo that part. We're making progress, we're getting somewhere, and working with the bias cut fabric was not that much of a nightmare. Only a little bit of a nightmare, but I think it'll work. I think we'll be okay. Okay, so it's been 3 weeks since I did that mock-up. I got distracted trying to grow a coat out of chia seeds, and then I decided I needed to learn how to weave, and then I had to get my wisdom teeth removed, and that was a whole thing. So it's been a while. I had to go back and rewatch the footage from the mock-up to remember how well it went. I had also forgotten that I had already cut apart that mock-up and transferred it to paper. I thought it was still in a pile on my ironing board, and I was like, oh my god, it's gonna be all warpy and weird, and it's not gonna be exactly what I cut out originally, and it's gonna have to redo it. But no, I was smart and I transferred it to paper. I think it's time to actually start making this dress. Another factor in this is I want to wear this dress to a wedding that I'm going to. I thought the wedding was 2 weeks from now. It's not, it's next weekend. It's currently Wednesday, so I've got like a week and a half to finish it, which I think is totally doable. At least the first dress. Probably not going to finish the second dress in time for that, but I only need one dress for the wedding. So now I need to actually cut out the fabric. Once I had my fabric laid out and folded diagonally, I could cut out all the pieces for the bodice. I did that little trick where you put magnets on your scissors to give you a little guide for adding seam allowance as you cut. Normally I'd just mark that out with a heat erase pen, or more realistically just eyeball it and hope for the best, but this fabric is so light and drapey it would have been a pain to mark it, but I still needed fairly precise allowances for this design, so the magnet trick was the perfect solution. With all the pieces cut out, I could begin assembly by stitching up the darts at the bust, pressing those open, and then stitching up all the other pieces. And I need to take a moment to appreciate this blessed seam alignment on the center front. The sewing gods were looking very kindly upon me that day. I've got all of the front panels sewn together. The darts were so annoying to do. This is like a lightweight rayon fabric. You can probably tell it's super slippery and floaty, and it's beautiful. It's gonna look great in the dress. It's just a nightmare to work with. And I already don't like sewing darts because they're just so fiddly, and there's like, it's just so hard trying to get everything lined up correctly and sew it down in a straight line. Doing that on floaty rayon, even less fun. Could have been worse, could have been satin. Got all the front pieces sewn up, got the back pieces sewn together. Those are staying as two separate pieces because there's going to be a zipper in the center back. So I'm going to press open all these seams, then I can sew the front and backs together, and then I can repeat the whole process with the
lining for the bodice. I'm hoping I can use this lightweight cotton that I have because it's a dark green, so I think it'll work well. It's definitely stiffer than this fabric, but it's not super heavy. It's not like a quilting cotton, it's a little bit lighter. And I'm hoping that cutting it on the bias as well will give it some drape. So hopefully it doesn't add too much structure to the bodice.
After stitching up all the bodice lining pieces, I had the very important step of going into my backyard to watch people get launched to the moon for the first time in 50 years, but it was really cloudy, so I could only see a little bit of the contrail. But I mean, like, oh no, I could only see some of the historic space launch from my backyard, how tragic. Then I got back to work cutting out long strips of the rayon that I could then sew into tubes, turn out, and sandwich between the bodice layers to make the straps. I sewed the outer layer and the lining together along the top edge, and then I decided to be extra fancy and understitch the seam allowance to keep the lining from showing along the neckline. Okay, so it is the next day. I got the outer layer and the lining all assembled and then sewn together. I went and pinned in a zipper so I could try it on. It fits pretty good overall, but the straps are a tiny bit too long. Had to pause last night because I realized the straps were too long, and I was sitting there thinking of all of the different things I could do to shorten them without having to unpick a tiny bit of seam and then adjust the length and restitch it. And in my experience, you shouldn't really trust the creative solutions you're thinking of after 8 p.m. So I put the sewing project down for the evening. I'm coming back to it in the morning. And yeah, the obvious solution is to just unpick a tiny bit of seam on both sides and then shorten the straps and then stitch it back down. It will be kind of annoying because I did like backstitch over the ends of the straps to like really secure them, and then I also went ahead and understitched the seam allowance to keep the lining from peeking out, which I don't normally do, and it was in fact very annoying to do, especially with these angles on the front, but it does work, unfortunately. And you do the things that all of the really experienced sewists tell you to do. Shockingly, it looks good. Hate it when that happens. So yeah, I'm going to unpick a little bit of the seam allowance, shorten these straps just a tiny bit to get it fitting right, and then I think I can move on to the skirt. For the skirt, I cut out 4 rectangular panels, 2 for the front and 2 for the back, with the top edge of all 4 cut at an angle to align with the waistline of the bodice. I also cut 4 triangular godets to go in between each skirt panel at the sides, center front, and center back, with the center back panel being split in half to accommodate the zipper. With everything cut out, I could begin assembling all the skirt pieces, which sounds like a quick and simple task, but I had to sew this first seam 4 times to get it right. I kept screwing up the placement and having to unpick the seam sewn into this lightweight, drapey, bias cut fabric. The first time I made the seam allowance was way too big. The second time I sewed the godet on about 4 inches too high, and the third time I sewed it on sideways. But the fourth time was just right. Luckily, the rest of the skirt came together without any further issues. I used French seams for all the panels to get a clean finish. I finished the open edges at the back of the skirt so that I could install the zipper later, and then I can baste the skirt and the bodice together and try the dress on. That is when I discovered that the skirt was too tight and wanted to ride up and create this bunching at the waist. I think because of the French seams, the godets at the sides didn't start right at the waistline. There were a few inches of straight seam first. So I unpicked those side seams, cut new, wider godets, and added them to the skirt using flat felled seams this time to make sure that the godet started at the very top of the skirt, which fixed my fit issues. Then I just had a few finishing steps after that. I leveled out the bottom edge of the skirt and hemmed it, then I could sew the bodice to the skirt, install the zipper, and then finish off the lining by hand. With the first dress finished, I can move on to the second stripy one. This fabric was much better behaved than the first. It's a plain weave cotton, slightly lighter than a quilting cotton, so it has a bit more drape and flowiness, but still so much sturdier than the rayon. The design I had in mind for this dress was also much more in my wheelhouse. It's made mostly out of rectangular pattern pieces and cut on the straight grain. I still started out with a mock-up. I cut 2 squares of fabric, split one down the middle, and sewed them up at the shoulders and side seams, which honestly, on its own, was pretty cute, but not what I had in mind for this project. So I pinned and trimmed and tweaked until I had a bodice shape I was happy with. Random side note, but the mail came while I was doing that mock-up, and I ordered a new phone case because my old one has developed handles, which is not particularly good, but my new one came in, and you know what color it is? You know what color it is? Guess what color it is? It's green. It's actually mostly white, but it's got green. From that bodice, I drafted a sleeve pattern that I then slashed up and spread out to create a voluminous puff sleeve. So I have finished the mock-up for the second dress. I'm really happy with how it came out. I quite like the fit of the bodice. I wanted something loose, but not like super baggy. And I'm also happy with the fullness of the sleeve. I'm actually planning on doing like 3 tiers of poofs for the sleeve. So like shoulder, elbow, forearm with bands in between and then a cuff. I didn't mock those up because once I get past the shoulder, they just become gathered rectangles, so I'm not too worried about getting the fit on those right. I didn't mock up the skirt either, but that's also just going to be gathered rectangles, so I'm not too worried about that. I am still unsure about the waistline though. Typically when I make dresses, I put the waistline at my natural waist. I think that's like the most common thing you'll see. But for this one, I was kind of considering putting the waistline higher, kind of like just under bust. Not quite an up here waistline where it's like right under your bust and a little bit more fitted, but like a little bit lower, like an inch or so, and then like more loosely fit. That was the idea, but I'm not sure if I'm gonna like that. But if I do a higher waistline, then the skirt also has to be longer, so it's gonna use up a little bit more fabric. So I think I'm just gonna go ahead and cut out my fabric and cut it out with the longer waistline, because then I can always shorten it if I want to. But then I can see if I have enough material to do the longer skirt, and then I can try it out with the higher waistline, and if I don't like it, I can just go with the longer one. So that is the plan. I'm gonna finish cleaning this up and then I can start cutting out my fabric. I cut apart my mock-up so I could transfer all my bodice pieces to paper, and I got to try out a trick I saw Sarah Hambley share on Instagram for adding seam allowance to a pattern. You just find 2 pens that are wide enough to mark out the seam allowance width that you want when held next to each other, and then you tape or rubber band them together and trace your pattern piece. It takes a bit of trial and error to find the right combo of writing implements, but it makes adding seam allowance so much faster. Once I had all my pieces marked out, I could cut them out from my striped fabric. One thing I wanted to do with this design was play with the orientation of the stripes, so I had to be careful when cutting things out. I also did my best to pattern match for the more obvious seams, like the bodice center front and center back, but I was less careful with the less visible seams. I basted the bodice and skirt together to try out the higher waistline, and decided I liked the look, but the neckline needed to be trimmed down a bit more before I could fully dive into construction. Okay, so it is the next day. I got all the pieces cut out yesterday and started assembling the bodice, and then I kind of got stuck as to what to do next. I just kind of sat there for a really long time, just like staring at everything, being like, what's going to be the best thing to do first? Like, what order should I work in? So I ended up making a list of all the things that I need to do, and then rearranging everything into what I think is going to be the best order. A lot of just sitting and like rearranging dominoes in my head of like, I can't do this until I do that, but if I want to do this, I have to do that before I do that and close that seam, because otherwise I'm not going to be able to have access to that, and then I have to do this first before I can do that. But I think I've got everything worked out, so I'm ready to start sewing things together. First thing on my list is to attach the lining to the bodice, just sewing around the center front edge and the neckline. I'm leaving the bodice open at the side so I can attach the sleeves more easily. And then also for this dress, I decided that I wanted to have this closed with like a lot of little buttons going down the front, because I like to make my life more difficult. But I also decided that I don't want to do buttonholes because I don't want to make my life that difficult. So I'm going to do little button loops. I've already gone ahead and sewed some little tubes of fabric to make those loops, and I need to capture those in the center front edge when I sew the lining to the outer layer of the bodice. With the base of the bodice constructed, I got to work on the sleeves. A French seam on these multiple tiers of puffs would be pretty bulky, so I did some nonsense to try and avoid that. I preemptively finished the short edges of the puff panels by pinking the edges, pressing them over once, and stitching them down. I probably should have just done a double fold hem for these, but alas, this is what I did for all 6 tiers. Then I ran 2 rows of gathering stitches along both long edges of all the puffs, and then I gathered each edge down to fit into its corresponding band. To attach the bands to the puffs, I sandwiched the gathered edge between a strip of the striped fabric and a matching lining, then sewed them all together. To attach the next puff to the band, I sewed the gathered edge to just the striped layer, right sides facing, pressed that seam open, then stitched in the ditch to secure the lining layer. I made sure not to sew down the ends of the lining bands, leaving the last ½ inch or so free to fold under later. Once all the tiers and bands were assembled, I gathered down the sleeve heads to fit into the arm size, and then I sewed the sleeves to the outer layer of the bodice. I finished the lining around the arm size by hand, and then I could sew up the side seams, again being sure to keep the ends of the sleeve band linings loose. The bodice was now wearable, but not quite the fit that I wanted. To keep the puffs in place, I fed elastic into the channels formed by the sleeve bands and their linings. I hand sewed the ends of each elastic piece together to make a ring, then I could turn the loose ends of the band linings under and hand sew those into place too. Now I can move on to the skirt. I cut extra long pocket pieces so that the ends could be secured in the high waist seam, while still having the pocket openings low enough to comfortably put my hand in. I sewed the pocket pieces to the skirt panels, then sewed the combined skirt and pocket pieces together, all with French seams. Next, I needed to add the button loops to the center front edge. I sandwiched each loop between the front skirt panels and a facing, which was just a long strip of plain white cotton. I sewed all those layers together, turned and pressed the facing open, then folded the long raw edge over and top stitched that down. Then I could hem the bottom edge and gather down the top edge to fit into the waistline of the bodice. I sewed the skirt to the outer layer by machine and then stitched down the lining layer by hand. Then all that was left to do was the buttons, so I marked out the placements and stitched them all on, and that finished green dress number 2. We're sitting on the floor for this wrap up because somebody is being very needy and whiny and wants attention. I'm very happy with both of these dresses. I think they came out quite nicely. The first dress, the sparkly bias cut one, is super cute, very nice, very like vintagey 20s, 30s vibe. I quite like it. I do think there's still a little bit of a fit issue. I think it's a little bit too long in the waist. If I'm not standing up super straight, it kind of bunches up in the middle, and I don't love that, but I guess it just encourages me to have better posture. I wore it to my cousin's wedding last weekend, and I was comfy the whole night, so 10 out of 10 on that. And then this dress is also very comfortable, nice lightweight, breathable cotton. The sleeves obviously aren't as comfy as they could be. They're, long, kind of big, a little cumbersome. The fitted band sections, they're not uncomfortable, but I'm like aware that they're there, so it's kind of like riding that line. But for the sake of how cool these sleeves are, I'm willing to deal with a little bit of discomfort. I quite enjoy having the stripes going in different directions on different parts of the dress. I really enjoy that as like a design element. If I could change one thing about this, I wish it had a fuller skirt. It's not gathered very much, and it's just flat rectangles, but I had to do it like this because of how much fabric I had. The sleeves obviously ate up quite a bit, and I would rather these be nice and voluminous and have a slightly less full skirt. If I could, I would, but I can't. So I shan't. Thank you so much for... That is it for today. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope I've inspired you to go make your own gloriously green garments, or whatever other color you have an unhealthy fixation on. I can't imagine what other than green, but, I guess. Do click on whatever buttons you feel so inclined to click on down below. It does help me out. Thank you to all of my patrons for supporting this channel, in particular those in the Magnanimous Maelstroms tier: Mara Jean Rue, Oscar, Obi-Knit Kenobi, Evelyn, Trapped in the Midwest, Bear Hardy, and Perfect Primrose. That is it. I will see you in the next one. Now for some closing words from The Apprentice.